The rain tapped lightly against my apartment window as the city's evening hum echoed in the distance. My hands, worn from years of work, gripped the ceramic coffee cup I'd used nearly every day since my wife passed. It wasn't fancy, just a simple mug with a fading pattern, but it was a piece of her, a small relic from a life that felt like it belonged to another man. The steam curled toward my face, bringing with it the bittersweet scent of the brew she used to make for us every morning. The apartment felt emptier than usual tonight. No faint laughter from the other room, no smell of fresh bread from the oven, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet. I glanced over at the bookshelf, where a framed photograph of my son, Daniel, sat between stacks of dusty novels. In the picture, he was 17, wearing his graduation cap, grinning with that same mischievous glint in his eyes he'd had since childhood. Back then, before the arguments about money, before the long silences, I thought we'd always be close. The shrill buzz of my phone on the counter cut through the quiet. I set the mug down carefully, my brow furrowing. I rarely got calls this late, and when I did, they were almost always from one of the restaurant managers needing advice about a supply order or a stubborn customer. But the screen displayed a name I hadn't seen in almost 2 years: Daniel. For a moment, I just stared at it. The last time we'd spoken, our words had been sharp, edged with resentment. He'd come to me for a loan, one I'd refused. Not because I didn't want to help him, but because I'd known deep down it wasn't going to solve his problem. The silence that followed had stretched on until I wondered if we'd ever speak again. I answered on the third ring, my voice rougher than I intended. "Hello?" There was a pause, then, "Dad." His tone was tentative, uncertain, like a boy caught in trouble. "It's me. I know it's been too long." I eased into the old leather armchair by the window, the one my wife had picked out years ago. "Yes," I said slowly. "It has. I've been thinking a lot lately," Daniel continued, "about how we've let things get so bad. I miss you, Dad, and Emma misses you too. We thought, maybe it's time we tried again." His words hung in the air, warm and heavy. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe my son had finally realized what we'd lost. "What are you saying?" I asked quietly. "I'm saying come to dinner. Tonight. Emma's making your favorite, that slow-cooked roast. We don't want to waste any more time." I pictured the last family dinner we'd had together, years ago. My wife's smile, the way Emma had tried so hard to make a good impression. It had all seemed so full of promise then. "Tonight?" I asked, surprised. "Yes, I'll text you the address. We moved last year, so it's a new place. You'll like it. 7:30? I hesitated for just a heartbeat before answering. "All right, I'll be there." The call ended, and I sat for a while in the fading light, staring out at the wet streets below. Something about the suddenness of the invitation nagged at me, but I pushed it aside. My wife had always said, families find their way back to each other if you give them the chance. I got up, moving slowly toward my bedroom. The navy suit hung in the back of the closet, still in its protective cover. She'd bought it for me when Daniel graduated. "You'll need something nice for special occasions," she'd said. I ran my fingers over the fabric, remembering that proud day, and decided this was the right time to wear it again. As I dressed, the phone buzzed once more. A text from Daniel with the address, Ford 15, Willow Park Drive. A place I didn't know, but judging from the name, probably far from my modest neighborhood. I poured myself a small measure of courage from an old bottle of whiskey, not to drink now, but to take with me. Something to share, something to break the ice. By the time the car pulled up outside, the city lights were reflected in the wet pavement, stretching like ribbons into the night. I climbed in, gave the driver the address, and leaned back against the seat. Somewhere between here and there, I told myself, was the chance to put my family back together. Little did I know, by the end of the night, I'd discovered just how far from the truth that really was. The ride started quietly, the city's familiar grit giving way to well-lit streets lined with pristine storefronts and carefully maintained sidewalks. The driver, a man in his late 40s with kind eyes, tried to make small talk about the weather, but my mind was elsewhere, running through memories of Daniel as a boy, wondering what he would look like now, how he would greet me after so much silence. As the car moved farther from my part of town, the scenery began to change. Narrow brick buildings gave way to larger houses with wide lawns and glowing porch lights. Soon, the streets were lined with iron gates, long driveways, and homes that looked like they'd been pulled straight from glossy real estate magazines. I glanced at the navigation screen mounted on the dashboard. "This is quite a neighborhood," I murmured. The driver chuckled. "Willow Park? Yeah, this area is something else. Doctors, lawyers, a few CEOs. Expensive to even breathe here." I nodded, though inside, questions began to stir. Daniel had been struggling the last time I saw him. Really struggling. He'd said he couldn't make rent, that his investment had fallen through. How could he possibly afford a home here? 15 minutes later, we turned onto a street so quiet it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The houses stood like monuments, massive stone facades, columns, sweeping staircases, and carefully designed landscaping. "This is it," the driver said, pulling into a circular driveway in front of a towering, pale stone house. A fountain in the center splashed gently under soft lighting, flanked by two gleaming luxury cars. For a moment, I stayed in the back seat, staring up at the place. It was overwhelming. Too much, maybe. The driver's voice broke my thoughts. "You want me to wait, sir?" I shook my head, handing him a generous tip. "No, thank you." Stepping out, the cool air wrapped around me, carrying the faint scent of flowers from the perfectly trimmed hedges. My shoes clicked against the stone walkway as I approached the tall oak front door. Before I could knock, it swung open. A woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled into a neat bun and wearing a black dress and apron, stood there. Her warm smile reached her eyes, but there was something else, something guarded, hidden beneath it. "Mr. Harris," she said politely, stepping aside. "Please, come in. They've been expecting you." The moment I crossed the threshold, I was hit by the subtle scent of expensive perfume and the faintest aroma of roasting meat. The foyer was stunning. Marble floors, a sweeping staircase, a chandelier that must have cost more than my entire apartment. From deeper inside the house, a familiar voice called out. "Dad!" Daniel appeared, striding quickly toward me. He looked different, healthier, sharper. His suit was perfectly tailored, his hair cut with precision. He hugged me tightly, maybe even a second too long, before stepping back with a grin that didn't quite meet his eyes. "You look great," he said. I managed a smile. "So do you, son. This is quite the place." Before Daniel could answer, Emma appeared at his side. She wore a deep green dress that shimmered under the chandelier's glow, her jewelry understated but clearly valuable. She kissed my cheek lightly, her voice soft and warm. "Jonathan, it's so good to see you again." They ushered me further inside, past rooms that looked like they belonged in a luxury catalog. Grand furniture, original paintings, fresh flower arrangements in crystal vases. "I brought something," I said, holding out the bottle of aged whiskey. Daniel's face lit up, though just for a moment. "Perfect. We'll open it with dinner." I nodded, though a small, uneasy thought took root in my mind. He seemed almost too eager for that drink. The housekeeper, Maria, as she introduced herself, took my coat with that same warm but distant smile and disappeared into another room. "Come," Emma said, looping her arm through mine. "The dining room is ready. Tonight is about family." And as I followed them, I couldn't shake the faint sense that tonight was also about something else, something I couldn't yet name. The dining room looked like it had been staged for the cover of a lifestyle magazine. A long mahogany table stretched nearly the length of the room, its polished surface gleaming beneath a crystal chandelier. Each place setting was arranged with surgical precision. Silver utensils aligned perfectly, cloth napkins folded into elaborate shapes, fine china that practically glowed under the warm light. At the center, a floral arrangement spilled over with white lilies and deep red roses. The scent was subtle but insistent, mingling with the rich aroma of something roasting in the kitchen. Daniel pulled out the chair at the head of the table for me, a gesture that felt both courteous and oddly strategic. Emma sat to my left, Daniel to my right, positioning themselves so they could both watch me without turning their heads. Maria appeared silently from the kitchen, carrying a tray of small appetizers, delicate bites arranged with the care of a jeweler setting gems. She placed them before us, her hands steady, but I noticed her eyes flick toward mine for a fraction of a second before she looked away. "Let's open that whiskey," Daniel said quickly, already reaching for the bottle I'd brought. He handled it like a prized artifact, examining the label before uncorking it. The amber liquid poured into heavy crystal tumblers, catching the chandelier's light in warm glints. He slid one glass toward me, another toward himself, and handed Emma her wine. "To family," Emma said smoothly, raising her glass. "To forgiveness and new beginnings." "To Mom," Daniel added, his voice catching just enough to seem sincere. I drank. The whiskey was smooth, warm, a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. Emma's smile was radiant, almost rehearsed, as she asked about the restaurants. "Daniel tells me you built them from nothing," she said, leaning forward with what looked like genuine interest. I chuckled softly. Nothing glamorous about it, just years of hard work. "Margaret, your mother, always said to treat employees like family and customers like friends. That's what kept us going." Daniel refilled my glass before I'd even set it down, his movements casual but a little too quick. I took another sip without thinking. Maria reappeared with steaming bowls of soup, lobster bisque, rich and velvety. As she set mine down, her hand trembled ever so slightly, and for a brief moment, her eyes met mine again. There was something there, something almost like warning, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Emma cut her bread with deliberate slowness. "Do you ever think about slowing down, Jonathan? Maybe retiring? You've done so much already," I smiled faintly. "One day, maybe, but the restaurants keep me busy. They're a piece of Margaret in a way. Every location has her touch on it." They both nodded, but there was an intensity in their gaze, like they were measuring my every word. Daniel leaned in slightly. "And when that day comes, retirement, have you thought about, what happens next? Who takes over?" The question landed heavier than I expected. I set my spoon down, studying him. "One day at a time, son. That's how I live now." Maria returned, this time carrying the main course. The pot roast's aroma filled the air instantly, so like Margaret's recipe that my chest tightened. Emma beamed. "I remembered you loved it. It was strange. We'd shared so few meals over the years. How could she have known that?" I took a bite. Perfect. Exactly like home. But beneath the comfort, an unease was starting to creep in. The way they kept my glass full, the way they kept the conversation circling back to my business, my future, my plans, it felt deliberate. The pot roast was tender enough to fall apart under my fork, the vegetables roasted to perfection. It should have been a comforting meal, one that pulled me back into memories of Sunday dinners with Margaret, but instead, every bite seemed to carry a strange weight. Daniel spoke animatedly about his new real estate ventures, though the details were vague. He kept the conversation moving quickly, never lingering long enough for me to ask probing questions. Emma, on the other hand, was more precise. Her questions were about profit margins, property values, and how I handled certain aspects of the restaurant operations. It was intense, too intense for a simple family dinner. Maria moved quietly between the kitchen and dining room, refilling water glasses, clearing plates. Her presence was steady, but every so often I caught her glancing in my direction. The look wasn't curiosity. It was something sharper, like she was keeping track of me. Or maybe, keeping watch over me. I lifted my whiskey glass again. The warmth spread quickly, faster than it should have for only a couple of drinks. My head felt just slightly lighter, like the edges of the room had softened. "Everything okay, Dad?" Daniel asked, watching me closely. "Fine," I said with a faint smile, setting the glass down. "Maybe I'm just not used to such rich food anymore." Emma leaned forward, her voice soft, almost coaxing. "We've all been through a lot. Sometimes the body just needs to slow down." Maria reappeared, and when she placed a fresh plate in front of me, her hand brushed mine ever so slightly. Deliberately, I thought. It was quick, almost nothing, but her eyes locked on mine for just a moment. There was no smile this time, just a silent, steady look. Before I could process it, Daniel reached over and topped off my glass again. The amber swirled in the crystal, catching the light. We continued talking, but something was gnawing at me now, an instinct I couldn't quite put into words. Their questions, their eagerness for me to drink, Maria's strange signals. Halfway through Emma's next question about whether I'd ever drafted a will, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I excused myself briefly, fishing it out under the table. The screen showed an unknown number, local area code. I frowned and opened the message. It was short, all caps. Get up and leave. Don't say anything to your son. For a moment, I thought I'd misread it. But no, the words were there, sharp and unrelenting, and suddenly the unease I'd been feeling solidified into something far colder. I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse thudding in my ears. The message was so blunt, so urgent, it made my skin prickle. Daniel's voice cut through my thoughts. "Everything okay, Dad?" I looked up, forcing my features into something neutral. "Just the restaurant manager, probably nothing urgent." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, careful not to let my hand tremble. But inside, my mind was racing. Who would send me a message like that? More importantly, why? Emma tilted her head, her eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "You sure you're feeling all right? You've gone pale." "I'm fine," I said, though the words tasted like a lie. "Just need to stretch my legs for a minute. Where's the bathroom?" Daniel gestured down the hall. "Second door on the left. We'll wait for you. Maria's bringing dessert." I stood slowly, testing my balance. The room swayed just slightly, though I'd only had what I thought was 2 glasses of whiskey. That was when it hit me. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Instead of turning left toward the bathroom, I continued straight, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet runner. The air felt different away from the dining room, quieter, heavier. Ahead, I saw the entrance to the kitchen. Maria was there, standing at the sink, washing crystal glasses with steady, deliberate movements. She didn't turn when I entered. The back door was just a few steps away, leading to a softly lit garden beyond. Freedom. As I passed her, she still didn't look up, but I caught the smallest shift in her posture. Her shoulders stiffened, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. She knew. I stepped outside. The cool air hit my face like a wake-up slap. Motion sensor lights flicked on, guiding me across the manicured lawn toward a gate at the far end. My shoes slid slightly on the damp grass, but I didn't stop until I reached the street beyond. I pulled out my phone again. My thumb hovered over the ride app before I made the request, setting the pickup point 1 block away from the house. Estimated arrival, 5 minutes. 5 minutes to decide if I was fleeing from nothing or from something that could have destroyed me. The car's headlights appeared at the end of the street. I climbed into the back seat and gave my Brooklyn address. But before the driver could even merge onto the main road, I dialed the number that had sent the text. It rang twice before a voice answered, low and controlled. "I hoped you would call." My throat tightened. "Who is this? Why did you tell me to leave?" There was a pause then, "Because you were in immediate danger tonight, and if you'd stayed, you'd have signed away everything you've ever worked for." I gripped the phone tighter, my free hand curling into a fist against my knee. "That's impossible," I said, my voice low. "I was having dinner with my son." The voice on the other end didn't waver. "Your son owes $2.3 million to people who don't ask twice for payment. They were expecting him to pay in 2 weeks. He doesn't have it. Tonight was his solution." The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, his brow knitting slightly as if he could sense the tension radiating off me. My chest felt heavy. "And what exactly do you mean by solution?" "They planned to drug you. The whiskey you brought contained a compound, zetroelum. It amplifies the effects of alcohol by 5 times, making you compliant, suggestible. They had legal documents prepared. Power of attorney. Transfer of all your business assets. Everything you've built would have been signed over before the night was done. And afterward, you likely wouldn't even remember it happened." The dizziness I'd felt earlier came rushing back in memory, too strong for the small amount I'd drunk. The strange warmth, the fog at the edges of my thoughts. I pressed my palm against my forehead. "How do you know all this?" A pause then. "Because I was there. I overheard them planning it, every detail." Pieces began slotting into place. The guarded look, the trembling hands, the fleeting moments of eye contact. "Maria," I said quietly. The voice was silent for a long moment before answering. "Yes." I closed my eyes, leaning back into the seat. "You risked your job to warn me." "I risked more than that," she said simply. "But I couldn't stand by and watch an innocent man be stripped of everything, especially by his own family." The car rolled through dark, quiet streets, the fountain-lined mansions giving way to less ostentatious neighborhoods. My phone screen lit with 3 missed calls from Daniel's number. "They'll realize you're gone soon," Maria warned. "And he's desperate. Desperate people don't stop after the first attempt. I stared out at the passing streetlights, the truth pressing down on me like weight I could barely hold. What should I do? Protect yourself. Move your assets. Talk to your lawyer, and don't let him anywhere near you until you're ready for the truth to come out. Her voice softened. I'm sorry, Mr. Harris. I know this hurts. Hertz didn't even begin to cover it. The driver's voice pulled me back. We're about halfway to Brooklyn. You still want to go home? I looked down at my phone again, at the 3 unanswered calls from my son, at the truth that now sat like a stone in my gut, and I realized I couldn't just disappear into safety. Not now. I needed to see this through. I tightened my grip on the phone, Maria's words still echoing in my head. The thought of quietly retreating to my Brooklyn apartment, locking the door, and letting the police handle it, twisted my stomach. That wasn't how Margaret would have wanted this to end. The driver glanced at me again in the mirror. Sir? I took a breath, my voice steady now. We're not going home. Change of plans. Take me back to Willow Park Drive. He frowned. You sure about that? You look like you've had a hell of a night. I'm sure, I said, meeting his eyes. Sometimes you have to walk back into the fire to put it out. As he turned the car around, I called 911. The dispatcher's voice was crisp, professional. I told them everything, what I'd been told, the suspected poisoning, the legal documents prepared to strip me of my assets. I gave the address, my name, and told them I was heading back to ensure the evidence didn't disappear. The dispatcher tried to talk me out of returning, warning it could be dangerous, but I was resolute. If I let them clean up, if I let the documents vanish, all I'd have left were my suspicions, and Daniel would try again. Officers are en route, the dispatcher said. They'll be there in about 20 minutes. I strongly advise you to wait until they arrive. I didn't answer her advice. 20 minutes was enough time for Daniel and Emma to destroy everything, and I knew they would. The ride back felt different than before. The elegant, quiet streets no longer looked charming. They felt like shadows where expensive crimes were born. Each mansion we passed was a reminder that money didn't equal morality. When we turned the corner onto Willow Park Drive, I saw the flashing headlights of 2 unmarked police cars pulling into position a block away. I asked the driver to drop me off just short of the house. The mansion stood as immaculate as when I'd arrived earlier, but now, instead of grandeur, I saw it for what it was. A trap wrapped in stone and glass. I climbed the steps and pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed inside like a warning bell. Footsteps approached quickly. The door swung open, and there was Daniel, relieved smile on his face, but eyes sharp, calculating. Dad, where the hell did you go? We were worried sick. I forced a weary smile. Just needed some fresh air, thought I'd come back and finish dinner. Emma appeared behind him, her face pale and tight. Jonathan, you scared us. Come in. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. They thought they still had a chance to finish what they started. They had no idea the clock was ticking. The air inside felt heavier now, thick with something unsaid. Daniel shut the door behind me, his smile stretched too thin. Glad you came back, Dad. We can pick up where we left off. Emma's eyes flicked to his, quick and sharp, before she slid an arm through mine. You must be tired. Let's sit you down. The dining room looked almost untouched, but I noticed subtle changes. The papers that had been stacked neatly earlier were gone, replaced by a spotless expanse of mahogany. Maria was nowhere in sight. Daniel gestured toward my chair, and I sat slowly, watching him move toward the liquor cabinet. Let's have one more toast, he said, voice overly bright. End the night on a good note. I leaned back. To what? To fresh starts, he said, carefully pouring whiskey into 2 glasses. His hand hovered over mine a second longer than necessary, the amber swirling thicker than normal. Emma settled beside me, her fingers grazing my shoulder. We all want to move forward, Jonathan. Tonight can be the first step, if you let it. I lifted the glass but didn't drink. Instead, I swirled it under the chandelier's light, catching sight of faint particles drifting lazily in the liquid. My stomach nodded. Daniel raised his own glass, expectant. Come on, Dad. I smiled faintly, keeping my tone calm. You know, your mother always said some things shouldn't be rushed. Good whiskey and important decisions. His jaw tightened just slightly. I think this is one of those nights you can make an exception. Footsteps sounded faintly from the hallway. 3 quick knocks followed. Police, open the door. Daniel froze, glass still in his hand. Emma's fingers dug into my shoulder, her breath catching. I set my drink down without a word. The perfect evening had just shattered. The knocks came again, harder this time. Police, open up! Daniel's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor. His face went pale, his eyes darting between me and the front door like a cornered animal. Emma stepped back, her perfect hostess mask cracking to reveal pure panic. Jonathan, what's going on? I didn't answer. From the foyer, heavy footsteps entered, followed by 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective. The lead officer's voice was firm, no room for negotiation. Richard Harris, you're under arrest for attempted poisoning, conspiracy to commit fraud, and elder abuse. Daniel's mouth opened and closed like he was searching for the right lie. What? No, this is insane, Dad. Tell them. This is just a misunderstanding. I stood slowly, my untouched glass still on the table. I held it out to the plainclothes detective. Test this. You'll find Zetroelum in it. The detective took the glass carefully, examining the faint sediment before sealing it in an evidence bag. This will hold up in court, he said quietly. Emma's voice rose, sharp and frantic. I didn't do anything. This was all Daniel's idea. The second officer moved toward her. Emma Harris, you're also under arrest as a co-conspirator. Her eyes widened, her voice dropping into a desperate plea. No, you don't understand. I was forced. Daniel cut her off, his voice cracking. Forced? You were the one who researched the drug. You were the one who told me how much to use. The officers moved quickly, cuffing them both. The clink of metal echoed in the pristine dining room, colliding with the sound of their overlapping denials. Daniel twisted toward me as they led him toward the door. Dad, how could you do this to me? I'm your son. I met his gaze, my voice steady but heavy. You chose this, Daniel. You could have come to me for help. Instead, you tried to steal everything your mother and I built. Emma's sobs filled the hall as they were escorted out into the cold night. The red and blue lights from the squad cars flashed through the tall windows, painting the walls in harsh, stuttering colors. Behind me, a soft sound broke the silence. Maria, stepping quietly into the room. For the first time that night, her guarded expression softened into something almost like relief. She didn't say, I told you so. She didn't have to. The door shut behind the officers, and for a moment the house was silent except for the faint hum of the chandelier's wiring. I stood there, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into my bones. The dining table, still set like a perfect photograph, now looked like the scene of a crime. Maria stepped closer, her voice low. They won't be back tonight. I turned to face her. You saved my life. She shook her head. I just did what anyone should do. No, I said firmly. You did what most wouldn't risk doing. Her eyes flickered toward the front windows, where the flashing lights still painted the manicured lawn in police blue. When I heard them planning it, I knew it was wrong. They spoke as if I wasn't even there, like I was invisible. I couldn't let them go through with it. The detective reappeared in the doorway. Mr. Harris, we'll need you to come down to the station to give a full statement. It's best we do it tonight while everything is fresh. I nodded, of course. He gave me a brief professional nod before heading back out to the cars. Maria followed me to the door. I don't know what's going to happen to me now. I doubt they'll keep me on after this. I paused, my hand on the doorframe. I have 7 restaurants, Maria, and I could use someone who knows the difference between loyalty and betrayal. Her brows lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. I'm offering you a job, I said simply. Management training, good pay, full benefits. You've more than earned my trust tonight. For a moment, her composure slipped and her voice trembled. I don't know what to say. Say yes, I told her. We'll talk details tomorrow. She gave a small nod, her lips pressing into the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. I stepped out into the cold night air, the crisp wind cutting through the lingering haze of the whiskey. 2 squad cars were already pulling away, Daniel and Emma's silhouettes faintly visible in the back seats. The detective gestured toward an unmarked sedan parked behind them. We'll drive you to the station, Mr. Harris. As I slid into the back seat, I glanced once more at the grand stone facade of Daniel's house. It looked as perfect as when I'd arrived earlier that evening. But I knew now that inside, Every inch of it had been bought and polished with desperation. And desperation, I reminded myself, is more dangerous than greed. The ride to the station was quiet except for the low crackle of the police radio. Streetlights flashed rhythmically across the window, each one pulling me further from the trap I'd nearly walked into. My mind replayed the night's events in sharp, jarring fragments. Daniel's too bright smile, Emma's carefully measured questions, Maria's fleeting glances, and that single text that had pulled me out of the lion's den. At the station, the detective, Harrison, his badge red, led me into a small interview room. The table was bare except for a recorder and 2 notepads. "We're going to take your full statement," he said, settling across from me. "Everything you remember. Start from the moment you got the invitation." I talked for over an hour, my voice steady even when the details cut deep. Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally jotting down notes. When I described the sediment in the whiskey, he nodded toward the evidence tech who had bagged the glass. "That sample is already on its way to the lab. It'll confirm the betrayal." From somewhere down the hall, I could hear Emma's muffled sobs. Harrison's gaze shifted briefly toward the sound before coming back to me. "They'll both be charged with multiple felonies. Attempted poisoning alone carries serious time. With conspiracy and fraud, your son could be looking at 20 years. I swallowed, my throat dry. "He's still my son." "I know," Harrison said, "but tonight he was also your would-be thief, and maybe worse." Through a small reinforced window in the door, I caught sight of Daniel in a holding cell. He was pacing, his hands running through his hair, his mouth moving in a low, desperate monologue I couldn't hear. For a second, he stopped and looked straight at me. The expression was a cocktail of fury, fear, and something else, pleading. I looked away. A short while later, after signing my statement, Harrison walked me toward the lobby. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" he asked. "My apartment in Brooklyn." "Good. Make sure the locks are secure. And you might want to speak to your lawyer first thing in the morning." I nodded. But as I stepped into the cool night air outside the station, I already knew sleep would be a long time coming. One decision remained heavy in my mind, whether I would ever speak to Daniel again. And right now, I didn't know the answer. The police arranged a ride back to Brooklyn, but before getting into the car, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the number that had saved me. I pressed call. It rang twice before Maria's voice answered, warm now, without the careful disguise from earlier. "Mr. Harris, are you all right?" "I am," I said quietly, "because of you." She hesitated. "I didn't know if you'd want to speak to me after all that happened." "I wanted to thank you," I told her, "and to tell you that offer I made earlier about working for me, that wasn't something I said in the moment. I meant it. I need people I can trust, and you proved tonight you're one of them." Her voice broke slightly. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll start Monday," I replied. 10 a.m. at my Crown Heights restaurant. I'll be there to train you myself." There was a pause, and then a soft laugh. "Yes, I'll be there." We said our goodbyes, and I ended the call. The ride back to my apartment felt different from the earlier trips. The city streets, still damp from the evening rain, reflected the lights in shimmering streaks. My neighborhood looked the same, humble, worn, but for the first time that night, I felt something close to peace. Inside, I hung my suit jacket neatly in the closet and went to the kitchen. The refrigerator was still covered in old photos. Daniel as a boy, Emma at their wedding, Margaret smiling beside us. I stared at Daniel's photo for a long moment before taking it down and placing it in the drawer. Not destroyed, not erased, just put away. Margaret's picture stayed on the door, her smile steady and kind. I sat at the small kitchen table listening to the faint sounds of the city outside. Somewhere, Daniel and Emma were sitting in separate holding cells, already working on their stories, their excuses. But the truth was locked in an evidence bag at the police station, swirling in the bottom of a crystal glass. And I had a witness who had chosen courage over silence. When I finally went upstairs, Margaret's perfume bottles still lined the dresser. I touched one lightly, as if her voice might come through it. "You'd have done the same thing," I whispered. And I knew she would have, because protecting what you've built and the people who deserve to be in your life isn't just about love. It's about knowing when to let go.